Hi, I'm Dan Schmitt. It's Team Chicago Challenge. Fortunate for me and for you, my audience, we were invited to come to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. I can't tell you how happy I am that I'm going to look at the library, but the things I'm going to point out mostly are the vehicles in the library. And I'm talking about Air Force One. The last 707 Air Force One is right here. One of the Marine One helicopters, the limousine that Ronald Reagan used when he was president, and a couple of, and there's 3 motorcycles here. So it's going to be an interesting story. I'm going to tell you about Air Force One, Marine One, the Cadillac that was the limousine that President Reagan used. And then we're going to also talk about Reagan's greatest accomplishment, and it was after he was president, but the strength of Ronald Reagan, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of England, and Pope John Paul II caused the Berlin Wall to come down, caused the end of the Soviet Union. And I'm going to tell that story also. So we're going to look at some of the great vehicles here from Air Force One, a couple motorcycles, and I think you have an enjoyable show on Team Chicago Challenge. I am replaying this show from 2017, my visit to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. This election in a few days is probably the most important election since 1860 and 1796. Donald Trump is as close to Ronald Reagan when it comes to being a constitutional conservative and believing in peace, truth, strength. In my mind, there is only one correct choice. On November 5th, we need to make America great again. As you drive up the road to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, approximately every 100 yards, there's another picture of one of the presidents of the United States. Up at the top here, you just saw the picture of President Ronald Reagan, and at the gate there's this photo of 5 presidents: George Bush, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, and Richard Nixon. And as we look at this panorama view, Southern California, Simi Valley, we are west of LA, in the atrium at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum. This great superstructure contains some of the greatest vehicles in American history. Air Force One, Marine One, Ronald Reagan's presidential limousine. Looking through the glass, we see Marine One and then Air Force One. This is Sam 27,000, an extended 707 specially built for the president. This 707 was used by Richard Nixon through President Reagan. This atrium is so impressive. This 707 standing in the middle. You can walk around it, you can walk through it, you can inspect it. At one time, the most prestigious aircraft in the United States of America and in the world. A symbol of freedom, a symbol of the USA. I should point out that President Eisenhower was the first president to use a 707. And then SAM, Special Air Mission 20 Whitney JT-3D turbofan aircraft engine on display. This engine first ran in 1958 and first flown in 1959. Over 8,000 of these engines were built between 1959 and 1985. 27,000 Air Force One. It came in to being used in December of 1972. So it was used by Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, President Reagan, and President Bush. This aircraft's last flight was in August of 2001, and it was totally disassembled and moved here. Let's look at the brief history of Air Force One. Now, the first president to fly an airplane was Teddy Roosevelt in 1910 in a Wright Flyer. He was not president at that time. We're looking at the Dixie Clipper, a Pan Am crewed Boeing 314 flying boat that was used to take President Roosevelt to the Casablanca Conference during World War II, where he met with Churchill and de Gaulle. The aircraft was replaced by the Douglas C-54 Skymaster, nicknamed the Sacred Cow. Roosevelt only used this aircraft one time, and that was to go to the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where he met with Stalin and Churchill. Truman also used that aircraft to attend the Potsdam Conference, where he met with Stalin and Churchill. And then in 1947, he acquired the C-118 Liftmaster, and this aircraft was called Independence after his hometown in Missouri, and it had the eagle on the nose of this C-118 Liftmaster. When Eisenhower became president, a Lockheed C-121 Constellation was used, and it was named Columbine after the state flower in Colorado. As we see President Eisenhower with the military air transport plane in the background, which in 1958 became a 707, replacing the C-121 Constellation. President Kennedy then used the 707 that Eisenhower used, and then in October of 1962, the United States Air Force purchased a Boeing C-137 Stratoliner, and it was specifically designed for the president. I should point out that Jacqueline Kennedy inspired her husband to contract well-known Studebaker designer Raymond Louis to come up with a proper color scheme for Air Force One. This fighter jet here is a Navy S-3B Viking. It was designated Navy One, and George Bush flew it onto the USS Abraham Lincoln in 2002. As you can see, the color scheme of Air Force One continues on with the 747-based Air Force One. President Bush, President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, and now President Trump used the 747-based aircraft, but they also use a 767 for smaller, shorter flights. We are now looking at Marine One. This is the helicopter maintained by the United States Marine Corps for presidential transportation. Now, that responsibility was shared with the United States Army until 1976. I believe this is a Sikorsky VH-3D, which entered service in 1978. It is a twin-engine, all-weather helicopter using two GE T-58 turboshaft engines. And I'm very happy these engines are on display. The United States Marine Corps is in charge of transportation of the president. And when the president is in his helicopter, it is referred to as Marine One. We can see in this array of photos President Reagan with Marine One on the south lawn of the White House. This is just another example of great vehicles on display at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. Now we're looking at Ronald Reagan's presidential limousine. This 1984 Cadillac limousine was presented to President Reagan in his hometown in Dixon, Illinois, on his 73rd birthday. 1984 Cadillac is 21 feet 8 inches long, and the wheelbase is 163 inches. As we see President Eisenhower in a 1952 Cadillac convertible, and then we see photos of President Reagan in Seoul, South Korea. A beautiful Cadillac limousine for the President of the United States, and a motorcade would not be complete without an escort. We see a LAPD Chevy squad car along with two Kawasaki KZ-1000 motorcycles that would have made up a motorcade for President Reagan. And the Secret Service would have been close behind in his Chevrolet Suburban. Also in this museum is a BMW motorcycle from the Simi Valley Police Department. This motorcycle was one of the motorcycles that participated in the funeral procession for President Reagan in 2004. I'm happy to see 3 motorcycles have been included at the Presidential Library in Simi Valley. And directly outside of the building is a F-14 Tomcat fighter jet. Ronald Reagan built up the United States military defenses during his 2 terms. And many historians believe that this defense buildup led to the destruction of the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan believed in peace through strength. Inside this great library is a display on the Cold War, a war that President Nixon said was World War III. It was a killing war. It was a shooting war. President Kennedy may have been the last Democrat to identify the threat to Western civilization by the communists, the Marxists, the Stalinists, the Maoists. Communism was anti-Western civilization. People were dying, going back to the Korean War in the 50s, the Vietnam War in the 60s, Cambodia, 2 million people dead. Mao killing 40 million of his Chinese neighbors. And the divided city of Berlin became the symbol. The Berlin Wall was built by Khrushchev to keep East Germans in, not to allow them to have freedom. The iron fist behind the Iron Curtain is what Churchill said. Ronald Reagan said they preached the supremacy of the state over individual men. They are the focus of evil in the modern world. March 8th, 1983. And it is all the same. Marxism, Stalinism, Leninism, progressivism, socialism. Yes, it was World War III in Africa, Asia, Central America, the Sandinistas, the Angolan battle, all evil It was President Reagan who stated, "It is here in Berlin, the brutal division of a continent upon the minds of the world." June 12, 1987. Berlin was a symbol, a divided city. In any country where you see the troops goose-stepping, remember, they are anti-Western civilization. They are saying with their marching that they hate freedom. They hate the USA. And now, in this present day, 2017, where are the old fools, the Dan Rathers, the Sam Donaldsons, the Tom Brokaw? I remember when they were screaming for President Reagan to meet with the butchers in Moscow. When will President Reagan meet with the Soviets? Where are they now to tell the truth? The old Soviet bloc was 100 times more powerful and dangerous than Putin and the reduced Russia. Remember, it was President Obama who elevated Putin with his goofy nuclear reduction scheme. And the young imbeciles, George Stephanopoulos, Anderson Cooper, are they too stupid to know true history? This Russian thing is a joke. 1 minute they love Russia, 1 minute Russia is not our friends. President Reagan, he knew the truth. He knew history. He spoke of the evil empire. President Reagan had honor and virtue. The Cold War was deadly and evil, with many evil characters: Chenenko, Mao, Andropov, Brezhnev, Khrushchev, Joseph Stalin, and Daniel Ortega with the Sandinistas.
Adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it now or ever.
So finally, the Soviet Politburo elected Gorbachev, and President Reagan agreed to meet with him.
Diplomatic talks stalled after Reykjavik. President Reagan travels to the Berlin Wall to deliver one of the most pivotal speeches in American history.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
2015, I was at the Reagan Library, and I put together this video clip explaining the fall of the Berlin Wall and the strength of Ronald Reagan.
Behind me is an example of the Berlin Wall. This is part of the Berlin Wall. And as you can see from this side of the wall, the people in West Germany could write graffiti on the Berlin Wall. They hated the Berlin Wall. The other side, there's no graffiti because no one could come within 300 feet of the wall if you were in East Berlin. This was given to the Reagan Museum because Ronald Reagan, let me tell you the story about how the Berlin Wall fell. This is one story you're not going to hear from many people, but I'm going to tell you a story as I know the story. First of all, nobody really knows why these young Germans had sledgehammers with them, brought a ladder, and climbed to the top of the Berlin Wall. Nobody knows. Were they out drinking that night? Was it a plan? But the West Germans got on top of the Berlin Wall with their sledgehammers, and they started hitting on the wall. It was symbolic. They wanted freedom. And the great story about this is, on the other side of the wall, within 200 feet, were East German guards, East German police with their machine guns, and they didn't quite know what to do when the young Germans were up on top of the wall trying to knock the wall down. They looked in their instruction manual, and they were only supposed to shoot their own people if they were trying to approach the wall. But they didn't know what to do when people were trying to knock the wall down. And these young East German police soldiers, all these years, the 2 years, 3 years they're on duty, they're looking over the wall. And what did they see in West Berlin? They seen BMW car, BMW motorcycle, Mercedes, girls in miniskirts, rock and roll, disco music was on that side of the wall. And these guys are looking on their side wall. What did they have? 4-cylinder, 2-stroke Ladas that barely worked, barely ran. So they probably laid their guns down and cheered that maybe the wall was going to come down. So what is the biggest significance of this being here? Let me tell you this. Ronald Reagan, our dear president, when he became president in 1981, Brezhnev was the commissar of the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan stated he would not meet with any leader that was not elected. Ronald Reagan refused to meet with Brezhnev. Brezhnev died. Andropov took over. Andropov was the guy with the Coke bottle glasses. Ronald Reagan refused to meet with Andropov. Andropov died. Chenenko came along. Ronald Reagan again refused to meet with Chenenko. Everybody, the media, the leftists, the progressives in America, the liberals in America, were all going crazy that Ronald Reagan refused to meet with any of the Soviet leaders. Finally, the Soviet Politburo got together and they elected Gorbachev. And then Ronald Reagan agreed to meet with Gorbachev because he was elected by the Politburo in the Soviet Union. So it was after Ronald Reagan was president. It was in 1989 that the Berlin Wall fell, but it was because of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Pope John Paul II. The strength of those three people created that miracle. The Berlin Wall fell. Ronald Reagan called for the Berlin Wall to come down. The Berlin Wall came down because of President Ronald Reagan.
Yes, it was the strength of President Ronald Reagan, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II. World War III was ended. The Soviet Union was over. That was back in 2015. We are now looking at a diorama of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum. You can see the atrium with Air Force One and all those other wonderful vehicles. It is great to be here in Simi Valley, California, walking through and understanding Ronald Reagan and his great presidency. In one of the courtyards is a statue of President Reagan on his horse. Ronald Reagan, the true cowboy. That cowboy attitude, that can-do attitude that makes America great. That makes America the greatest and wealthiest nation on earth. In 2016, Nancy Reagan joined her husband here. The memorial for the President of the United States with his lovely wife. Ronald Reagan, February 6, 1911 to June 5th, 2004. Nancy Reagan, July 6, 1921 through March 6, 2016. And it is written, I know in my heart that man is good, that what is right will eventually triumph, and there is purpose and worth in each and every life. Yes, President Ronald Reagan was the greatest. He defeated the Soviets without firing a shot. President Donald Trump is just as great. He believes in peace, truth, strength, and making America great again. protecting our industries, protecting steel production, aluminum production. He's the one that made us energy independent, the greatest freedom you could give to America. And where is President George Bush? Where is he hiding? Now is the time he could come out and show his support for President Trump. His silence is deafening. Is he a traitor like the Cheneys? Yes, I was so lucky to be able to visit the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library 3 times, and one time while it was still under construction. To contact me, and I love to hear from my audience, it's teamdan45@gmail.com. And remember, you can always search on YouTube with Dan Schmitt Motorcycle Racing for great motorcycle racing action, Dan Schmitt Politics, to learn what makes America great. And I highly encourage you to visit the World of Motorcycle Museum. They're in Winamac, Indiana on Highway 39, 4 miles south of North Judson. But give them a call first at 574-896-3172. It's a great trip and a great collection of motorcycles. And to pick up your copy of the Team Chicago History Package, stop by Rich's Yamaha in Lockport, Illinois, but give them a call first at 815-838-8130. Their website is richesyamaha.com. And if you want to learn about motorcycles, there's nothing like going to a motorcycle swap meet. Here's a few dates for the 2024 season. WalneckSwap.com is the website. You got Woodstock, Morris, Shepherdsville, Princeton, Springfield, Ohio. You'll learn something about the history of motorcycles.